For more than 40 years, a family lived beyond the reach of roads, newspapers, radios, and almost every other human being. Hidden deep inside a wilderness that seemed to have swallowed them completely, they survived by hunting, planting what little food the soil would give them, repairing the same worn clothes again and again, and teaching their children to fear a world none of them had actually seen. They believed that somewhere beyond the mountains, the war was still raging. They believed soldiers were still searching the forests, cities were still burning, and stepping outside their hidden valley could mean death. So they stayed. Years became decades. Children grew into adults. Parents became old. The outside world rebuilt itself, borders changed, governments disappeared, machines transformed everyday life, and an entirely new generation was born. But inside that isolated valley, time seemed to remain frozen. Then, one ordinary morning, something appeared above the trees. At first, the family thought it was an enemy aircraft. The strange machine circled their valley while they rushed toward the cabin, terrified that the nightmare they had spent decades avoiding had finally found them. But the people inside that aircraft were not soldiers looking for fugitives. They were explorers who had stumbled across something they could barely believe: cultivated land in a place where no settlement was supposed to exist. Days later, strangers entered the valley. The family prepared for the encounter they had feared for most of their lives. But instead of gunfire, there were questions. Instead of soldiers, there were bewildered visitors staring at people who seemed to belong to another era. And then came the sentence that changed everything. The war they had spent 40 years hiding from had ended decades earlier. For the family, it was almost impossible to understand. Their isolation had protected them from a danger that had disappeared long ago, but that protection had demanded an extraordinary price. They had lost more than 40 years of the outside world. And when they finally discovered what had happened while they were gone, returning to civilization would prove far more complicated than anyone imagined. There are places on Earth where distance can become almost unimaginable. Forests stretch beyond the horizon, mountains erase roads, winters close entire regions, and a person can disappear into the landscape without leaving more than a faint trail behind. Throughout history, people have entered these remote places for many reasons. Some searched for freedom. Others escaped persecution. Some wanted nothing more than silence. And a few believed isolation was the only thing standing between their families and death. This is the story of one such family. Their decision began during a period of fear and uncertainty, when rumors traveled faster than reliable information and ordinary families sometimes had little idea what was happening beyond their own villages. War had transformed the world around them. Men disappeared into armies. Communities were abandoned. Food became scarce. Stories of arrests, destruction, and approaching soldiers spread from one settlement to another. Nobody knew which rumors were true, but waiting to find out could feel more dangerous than running. So one family made a decision that would shape several generations. They would leave. Not for another city. Not for another country. They would travel toward a place where they believed no army would ever bother searching for them. Deep wilderness, beyond established settlements and far from the routes used by ordinary travelers. They carried only what they could transport themselves: tools, seeds, clothing, containers, a few objects from the home they expected never to see again. Everything else was abandoned. At first, they believed their disappearance would be temporary. Perhaps they would remain hidden for several months, maybe a year. When the fighting stopped, they could return. But there was one problem. Once they entered the wilderness, there would be nobody to tell them when the danger had passed. And as the seasons began to change around their tiny hidden settlement, the family slowly lost their final connection with the world they had left behind. The family left before sunrise. There was no farewell gathering, no wagon filled with furniture, and no promise that they would return by a certain date. Their departure was deliberately quiet. In the darkness, they carried bundles containing only what they considered essential: a few cooking utensils, simple tools, blankets, seeds, dried food, spare clothing, and whatever small possessions could survive a journey into country where there would be no shops, roads, doctors, or neighbors. Behind them stood the life they understood. Ahead of them was wilderness. Yet on that morning, the wilderness seemed less frightening than the possibility of remaining where they were. Fear had changed the meaning of safety. A forest filled with cold, hunger, and wild animals suddenly appeared safer than a village connected to a world at war. The father led them away from the familiar paths. He understood that simply moving several kilometers into the countryside would accomplish nothing. If they truly wanted to disappear, they needed distance and terrain strong enough to hide them. They followed narrow trails through increasingly dense forest, crossed streams where the freezing water reached their knees, climbed slopes carrying everything on their backs, and slept beneath temporary shelters whenever darkness made continuing impossible. Every kilometer made returning more difficult. The children occasionally asked how much farther they had to travel. The answer was always similar: farther. Far enough that nobody would accidentally find them. Far enough that soldiers would have no reason to search. Far enough that the sounds of civilization would disappear completely. Eventually, even the trails vanished. That was exactly what the father wanted. He began navigating by rivers, mountains, sunlight, and landmarks rather than roads. The family moved slowly because every step now required judgment. A wrong turn could lead toward impassable terrain. An injury could become catastrophic. They had entered a world where the smallest mistake carried consequences that people living near civilization rarely had to consider. Yet the deeper they traveled, the more convinced they became that they were escaping the danger behind them. They could no longer hear vehicles. They saw no smoke from distant houses. At night there were no artificial lights anywhere on the horizon. The world had become enormous, dark, and silent. After many exhausting days, they reached a secluded valley surrounded by forest and natural barriers. A river provided water. A small area of relatively open ground offered the possibility of growing food. Trees supplied timber and fuel. Most importantly, there was no visible evidence that anyone else lived nearby. To the exhausted family, the valley seemed almost designed for disappearance. They stopped traveling. The bundles were placed on the ground, and for the first time since leaving home, they understood that this place might become more than a temporary refuge. It might become their entire world. Their first shelter was crude. Branches formed the frame, bark and vegetation helped cover openings, and every available piece of fabric was used against the cold. Nobody complained about comfort because survival came first. The father immediately began thinking about winter. Food had to be secured. Firewood had to be collected. A stronger cabin had to be built. Seeds needed soil before the growing season disappeared. Each day became a race against conditions that did not care why the family had come there. The wilderness had offered them protection from human beings, but it demanded constant work in exchange. At night, however, another fear remained. Whenever a branch snapped unexpectedly or an unfamiliar sound traveled through the trees, everyone stopped moving. The children had been warned repeatedly that strangers could be dangerous. A distant noise might mean hunters. Smoke might reveal their location. Footprints could lead someone directly to the cabin. They therefore learned to erase signs of their presence whenever they traveled beyond the settlement. The family did not simply live remotely. They actively tried to remain invisible. Weeks passed without encountering another person. Then months. The silence that had initially frightened them gradually became reassuring. Perhaps they had succeeded. Perhaps nobody knew where they were. The father began constructing a permanent cabin from timber cut nearby. The children helped carry smaller branches and stones. Their mother organized food supplies with almost obsessive care because she understood that losing even a small portion could become dangerous during winter. Nothing was wasted. Broken objects were repaired. Clothing was patched. Ash from the fire had uses. Animal bones could become tools. Every possession acquired a value far beyond what it had possessed in their former home. But their greatest problem was information. They had no radio powerful enough to connect them reliably with distant settlements, no newspapers, no travelers, and no way to know what was happening outside the valley. When they had left, the war had seemed enormous and unpredictable. Without new information, that final image of the outside world remained unchanged. The family naturally assumed the danger continued. Why would they risk everything by returning merely because several months had passed? They decided to wait longer. The first winter nearly broke them. Temperatures dropped dramatically, food became monotonous, and the landscape that had seemed green and abundant transformed into a frozen prison. Snow covered familiar routes. Hunting became difficult. The cabin required constant repair. They spent long periods gathered around the fire while wind pushed against the walls. During those nights, the parents repeated stories about the world they had escaped. They reminded the children why they were there. Whatever hardship existed in the valley, they said, it was better than being discovered by soldiers. When spring finally returned, the family had survived something they had once considered almost impossible. That success changed their thinking. They now knew they could live there. They planted again, expanded their small cultivated area, improved the cabin, and prepared more carefully for the next winter. Temporary survival was slowly becoming a permanent way of life. 1 year passed. Then another. No soldiers appeared. No aircraft landed. No messenger walked through the forest announcing that it was safe to return. From the family's perspective, silence did not prove that the war had ended. Silence proved that their hiding place was working. And so they remained. Far beyond their valley, history continued moving. Battles ended. Political decisions were made. Soldiers returned home. Communities began rebuilding. The world gradually stepped into another era. But the family never received the news. For them, the final chapter of the outside world remained the same chapter they had witnessed before disappearing into the forest. And without realizing it, they had begun the first years of an isolation that would last for decades. Far beyond the mountains and forests surrounding the family's hidden valley, the world was changing quickly. The conflict that had once seemed endless finally reached its conclusion. Soldiers began returning home. Families who had spent years separated were reunited. Roads reopened, damaged communities started rebuilding, and governments turned their attention from survival toward reconstruction. For millions of people, the end of the war became a dividing line between two eras. There was the world before it, filled with uncertainty and fear, and the world after it, carrying the difficult promise of normal life. Newspapers printed the news in enormous letters. Radio stations repeated announcements across entire countries. Crowds gathered in cities and villages. People celebrated, mourned those who would never return, and began imagining futures that had seemed impossible only months earlier. But none of those voices could cross the wilderness and reach the small wooden cabin where one family was still waiting for a danger that no longer existed. Inside the valley, life continued according to a completely different calendar. The family did not measure history by elections, treaties, inventions, or political changes. Their important events were the first frost, the arrival of spring, the success of a harvest, the birth of an animal, the repair of a roof, or the discovery of new hunting ground. A year was not remembered because of something that happened in a distant capital. It was remembered because potatoes grew particularly well, because winter arrived early, or because the river flooded farther than usual. Slowly, the events that shaped the rest of humanity became meaningless to people who had no knowledge that they were occurring. The parents still spoke about the war, especially when the children asked about the world beyond the forest. Their memories became the family's only source of information. They described villages, roads, churches, markets, machines, soldiers, and crowds. To the younger children, these descriptions increasingly sounded like stories from another universe. They could understand a forest because they walked through one every day. They understood rivers because they depended upon one for water. But imagining hundreds or thousands of strangers living close together became increasingly difficult. Civilization was transforming from a memory into an idea. Occasionally, the father considered returning. During the first few years, the possibility remained real. Perhaps he could travel alone toward the nearest settlement, observe from a distance, and discover whether conditions had improved. But every time he considered the journey, uncertainty stopped him. What if soldiers were still searching? What if the political situation had become worse? What if someone recognized him and forced him to reveal where his family was hiding? Their isolation had worked precisely because they had avoided contact. One journey could destroy everything they had built. The absence of evidence became evidence in his mind. Nobody had found them. Therefore, hiding must still be necessary. That reasoning became increasingly powerful with time. Every year they survived reinforced the decision made the year before. Returning became psychologically harder because it would require admitting that perhaps they had remained hidden longer than necessary. Staying required no such risk. The valley was difficult, but it was familiar. Beyond the mountains waited uncertainty. The children absorbed this fear differently. Those old enough to remember their former life occasionally asked questions about returning. They remembered houses built differently from their cabin. They remembered other children. They remembered foods they could no longer eat and objects that could not be manufactured in the forest. But those memories faded. Younger members of the family had almost no memories at all. For them, the valley was not a refuge. It was home. Their isolation also created an unusual problem. Possessions slowly disappeared. Metal tools wore down. Handles broke. Fabric tore until patches covered patches. Containers cracked. Needles became precious. Nails removed from damaged structures were carefully straightened and used again. Nothing could simply be replaced. If something disappeared, the family had to manufacture an alternative from wood, stone, bone, leather, or whatever materials nature provided. This forced them to develop remarkable practical skills. A broken object was never considered useless until every possible repair had failed. Children learned these skills almost as soon as they could work. Knowledge passed directly from parent to child because there were no books explaining new techniques and no outsiders bringing different methods. The family gradually created its own small technological world, built from memories of the past and solutions invented through necessity. Meanwhile, beyond the forest, technology accelerated. Electricity reached communities that had never possessed it. Radios became common. Transportation improved. Medical treatments advanced. Household appliances changed daily routines. Later came technologies that would have seemed almost unimaginable when the family disappeared. Human beings traveled farther and faster. Communications crossed enormous distances almost instantly. Entire industries emerged. The hidden family experienced none of it. Their world remained powered by muscle, fire, flowing water, sunlight, and the limited tools they had carried into the wilderness decades earlier. The contrast grew greater every year. At first, they were perhaps only a few years behind the outside world. Then 10 years. Then 20. Eventually, the difference was not merely technological. Their clothing, vocabulary, expectations, habits, and understanding of society belonged increasingly to the period in which they had vanished. The parents aged. Their hair turned gray. Their movements slowed. The children became adults and took over more of the demanding physical work. Yet the story explaining their isolation remained unchanged. Somewhere beyond the mountains was a dangerous world from which their parents had once escaped. The war became almost mythical. For the first generation, it was memory. For the next, it was inherited fear. They knew soldiers existed because their parents said so. They knew terrible things had happened because the older generation had witnessed enough to convince them. Without contradictory information, there was little reason to question those warnings. The forest itself seemed to confirm them. Why had nobody come? Why had their parents abandoned everything if the danger had not been serious? Years accumulated quietly. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. The family's original cabin was repaired so many times that few pieces of the first structure remained. New storage areas appeared. Small plots of cultivated land expanded around the settlement. Paths formed between the cabin, river, garden, and hunting areas. Children who had arrived frightened and confused were now adults who could barely imagine living anywhere else. The outside world was becoming something none of them could accurately picture. Yet there were moments when evidence of its existence appeared. Sometimes a distant sound crossed the sky. The family would stop working and look upward. An aircraft. Early encounters with these machines caused immediate fear. The parents ordered everyone toward cover. They worried that the aircraft might belong to military forces. Even after it disappeared beyond the horizon, they remained cautious for hours. No one knew whether it had seen them. As aircraft became more common in the outside world, occasional sightings increased. But from the family's perspective, this did not necessarily mean peace. It could mean the opposite. Perhaps the war had grown larger. Perhaps machines had become more powerful. Their lack of information allowed every observation to fit the explanation they already believed. So they became more careful. Smoke was controlled whenever possible. Trees helped conceal structures. Cultivated areas remained small enough to blend with the landscape from a distance. They avoided creating obvious trails leading toward their home. Ironically, these precautions helped extend their isolation. People passed through distant regions without knowing anyone lived in the valley. Maps showed wilderness. Officials had little reason to investigate. Travelers followed easier routes. The family existed in a geographical blind spot, close enough to civilization to share the same planet but distant enough to remain outside its attention. Eventually, the parents stopped seriously discussing returning. The decision had been made through repetition rather than a single conversation. The longer they remained, the more impossible leaving seemed. Their old home might no longer exist. People they once knew might be dead. They possessed no current documents, no money useful in the modern economy, and no understanding of how society had changed. Even if the war had ended, another danger might have replaced it. The valley had become predictable. Civilization had become frightening precisely because they knew nothing about it. Then the family crossed a milestone none of them celebrated. 40 years had passed since they disappeared. 40 winters. 40 springs. An entire human lifetime had unfolded beyond their forest. The children who had entered the wilderness were now approaching old age themselves. Some younger members of the family had never spoken with a stranger. The world outside had transformed so completely that if they suddenly entered a modern town, almost everything around them would appear unfamiliar. Yet the family still believed the decision made decades earlier had saved them. Then, one day, a sound appeared above the valley. Louder than usual. Closer than anything they had heard before. Everyone looked toward the sky. An aircraft was descending. And this time, it did not continue toward the horizon. It began circling directly above their home. The sound reached them before they could see its source. At first it was little more than a distant vibration rolling across the mountains, faint enough to be confused with wind or thunder. But instead of fading, it grew steadily louder. The family stopped working. Tools were lowered. Conversations ended. Everyone turned toward the trees and listened. They had heard aircraft before, distant machines crossing high above the wilderness before disappearing beyond the horizon, but this was different. The sound was approaching their valley, and within moments it became powerful enough to echo between the surrounding slopes. Then the aircraft appeared above the trees. Panic spread almost immediately. The older members of the family reacted according to fears they had carried for decades. They ordered everyone toward the cabin and the cover of the forest. Food and tools were abandoned where they lay. Nobody knew who was inside the aircraft or why it had come so close, but the possibility that they had finally been discovered seemed terrifyingly real. For more than 40 years, their safety had depended on remaining invisible. Now a machine from the outside world was flying directly above the place they had worked so carefully to conceal. The aircraft passed over once, disappeared behind the trees, and then returned. That second pass frightened them even more. This was no coincidence. Whoever was above them had seen something. Inside the aircraft, however, the situation looked very different. The people surveying the remote region had not expected to find anyone living there. From above, the landscape appeared almost untouched, immense stretches of forest interrupted by rivers, rocky terrain, and occasional clearings. Then someone noticed something unusual below. Straight lines. Small cultivated patches. A structure partly hidden among the trees. These were not ordinary features of untouched wilderness. Someone had altered the land. The aircraft circled again. From the ground, the family watched through gaps in the forest canopy. Some feared that armed men would soon appear. Others wondered whether they should abandon the settlement immediately and travel deeper into the wilderness. The father who had originally led them there was now an old man, and the younger generation looked toward him for guidance. Yet even he had no answer. The possibility he had feared throughout most of his life was finally happening, but it looked nothing like the scenarios he had imagined. Then something fell from the aircraft. Everyone retreated. The object descended toward an open area and landed away from the cabin. For several minutes, nobody approached it. They watched from the trees, expecting perhaps another aircraft or people to follow. Nothing happened. Eventually, curiosity began competing with fear. One of the younger adults moved carefully toward the object while the others remained behind. It was not a weapon. It was a package. Inside were ordinary goods from the outside world, but to the isolated family they seemed extraordinary. materials they had not touched in decades, manufactured objects with surfaces and designs unlike anything they possessed. Even simple items revealed how far the world had moved beyond them. Their own belongings had been repaired, reshaped, and reused for generations. Here were objects made with methods they did not recognize. The package created a problem more complicated than fear. If the people in the aircraft had wanted to attack them, why send useful supplies? Perhaps it was a trick. Perhaps strangers were attempting to lure them into revealing themselves. The older members urged caution. They had survived precisely because they had learned never to trust the unknown. For the next several days, the family watched the sky constantly. Every distant sound caused someone to look upward. But nothing came. Then the aircraft returned. This time, the family did not immediately disappear into the cabin. They remained near the edge of the trees, still cautious but curious enough to watch. The aircraft circled again, lower than before. Another package was dropped. The gesture was unmistakable. Whoever was flying above knew they were there and was trying to communicate without approaching. The family's isolation had been broken. They could no longer pretend the outside world did not know where they lived. That evening, they gathered inside the cabin and discussed what to do. Some wanted to leave immediately. There were still enormous areas of wilderness where they might disappear again. Others resisted. This valley contained everything they had built over 4 decades. Their gardens, tools, shelters, stored food, memories, and graves were there. Leaving would mean starting again with fewer resources and older bodies. There was another question nobody could answer. Who were these people? The family possessed a mental picture of the outside world frozen decades in the past. They expected strangers to dress, speak, and behave according to memories from another era. The aircraft itself suggested enormous changes, but without context they could not understand them. They did not know which government controlled the region. They did not know whether the conflict they feared had ended. They did not know whether the villages they remembered still existed. The next contact would force them to confront those questions. Several days later, the aircraft appeared once more. But this time, after circling the valley, it traveled away in a direction the family had learned to recognize. Then came silence. Morning passed. Afternoon approached. The family returned cautiously to their routines. And then one of them noticed movement near the edge of the forest. At first, it looked like an animal moving between the trees. Then another shape appeared. And another. Human beings. Strangers were walking toward the settlement. The family gathered near the cabin. Some held tools because they possessed little else with which to defend themselves. Nobody moved forward. Nobody knew whether to run. After more than 40 years of isolation, several members of the family were about to stand face to face with people from the outside world for the first time in their adult lives. The strangers emerged slowly from the trees. Their clothing looked unfamiliar. Their equipment was stranger still. Everything about them suggested a world the family did not recognize. Yet the visitors did something surprisingly simple. They stopped at a respectful distance. They raised their empty hands. And they spoke. The family understood enough of the words to realize that these men were not announcing an arrest. They were asking questions. Who were they? How long had they lived here? Where had they come from? The family answered cautiously. At first, their responses were short. They refused to reveal more than necessary. But the visitors were visibly astonished as fragments of the story emerged. Decades. The family had been there for decades. One visitor eventually asked why. The older man explained. They had fled because of the war. The strangers exchanged confused looks. For a moment, nobody responded. The family noticed the reaction immediately. Something was wrong. Perhaps the visitors had misunderstood. The old man tried to explain again. They had entered the wilderness to escape the fighting. They had remained because they could not know when it would be safe to return. One of the visitors stared at him, struggling to understand what he was hearing. Then he asked a question that must have seemed almost absurd. Did they really believe the war was still happening? The family looked back at him. Of course they did. Why else would they still be hiding? There was a long silence. And then, after more than 40 years, someone finally told them the truth. The war was over. Not recently. Not several months earlier. It had ended decades ago. At first, the family thought they had misunderstood. Then they thought the strangers might be lying. But as the visitors began describing the world beyond the forest, the impossible reality slowly became clear. The danger that had shaped almost their entire existence had disappeared long ago. For 40 years, they had been hiding from a war that existed only in their memories. The words were simple, but the family could not immediately understand them. The war had ended. The visitors repeated the message slowly, believing perhaps that the isolated family had misunderstood. But language was not the real problem. The family understood every word individually. What they could not understand was how those words could possibly describe reality. For decades, the war had been the invisible boundary surrounding their valley. It explained why they avoided strangers, why they concealed their home, why they never attempted to return, and why generations had been taught that the world beyond the mountains was dangerous. Now several strangers were standing in front of them calmly explaining that the event around which they had built their entire existence belonged to distant history. The older members reacted with suspicion rather than relief. From their perspective, trusting the visitors immediately would have contradicted everything that had kept them alive. Perhaps this was exactly what an enemy would say to convince them to leave their hiding place. Perhaps the conflict had changed names or governments but continued in another form. The old man questioned the visitors repeatedly. Who had won? What happened afterward? Which governments now controlled the region? What had happened to the communities they remembered? Each answer produced another question, and each question revealed just how enormous the informational gap had become. The visitors soon realized that explaining 4 decades of history was almost impossible. How could anyone compress 40 years into a conversation beside a wooden cabin? The world had not simply returned to the way it had been before the family disappeared. Political boundaries had shifted. Leaders had risen and fallen. Technologies had transformed communication and transportation. Entire generations had grown up knowing the war only through history books and stories told by grandparents. Events the family considered immediate and dangerous had become material studied by children in classrooms. One visitor tried to establish the timeline using dates. He named the year the war had ended and then told them the current year. The difference stunned them. The younger members began calculating their own lives against those numbers. Some had spent almost their entire existence hiding from something that had ended before they were old enough to remember it clearly. Others had been born in isolation after the fighting was already over. Their fear of the war was therefore not based on personal experience at all. It had been inherited from their parents and reinforced by decades without outside information. For the oldest generation, the realization carried a different weight. They had made the original decision to leave. At the time, it had seemed necessary. Nobody standing there could fairly judge the fear they had experienced during the conflict or the uncertainty that had surrounded their departure. But another realization was unavoidable. There had been a moment, many years earlier, when they could theoretically have returned. They simply had not known it. The old man became quiet. For much of his life, he had believed that bringing his family into the wilderness had protected them. Now he was being forced to consider a painful possibility. The decision may indeed have saved them initially, but the same decision had eventually become a prison maintained by fear and missing information. One of the visitors attempted to reassure him. There was no accusation in the conversation. Nobody had come to punish them. The outsiders were more astonished than judgmental. They wanted to understand how a family could remain hidden for so long and how they had survived without regular contact with society. But the family was not ready to tell their entire story. They had a more urgent concern. Was it truly safe outside? The visitors said yes, although explaining modern society made that answer complicated. The specific war the family feared had ended decades earlier. Roads connected settlements. People traveled freely through areas the family believed might still be controlled by military forces. Towns had expanded. Markets operated normally. Children attended schools. Radios and televisions carried information across enormous distances. The world had problems, certainly, but it was not the battlefield preserved in the family's imagination. Then the visitors showed them objects they had carried. A small device produced sound. The family stared. One of the younger members moved closer while the older people remained cautious. A voice emerged from the device, clear and immediate. To people accustomed only to human voices spoken within physical distance, hearing someone who was not present seemed almost impossible. The visitors explained that voices could now travel enormous distances. News could reach people quickly. A person no longer needed to wait for a traveler to discover what had happened hundreds of kilometers away. For the family, this simple demonstration carried an almost cruel irony. The technology in front of them represented exactly what they had lacked: information. Had they possessed reliable communication decades earlier, their entire history might have been different. Other ordinary objects created similar reactions. Modern fabrics felt unfamiliar. Packaging seemed wastefully elaborate compared with the family's habit of preserving every scrap of material. Manufactured tools appeared remarkably precise. Even something as ordinary as a flashlight seemed extraordinary when compared with firelight and the primitive lighting methods they had relied upon for decades. Yet the visitors quickly learned not to overwhelm them. Curiosity and fear existed together. The younger generation wanted to inspect everything. The older generation worried that unfamiliar objects might create dependence on outsiders. Their survival had been built around self-sufficiency. Accepting manufactured goods meant acknowledging that another world existed beyond the valley and that perhaps they were no longer completely separate from it. As evening approached, the visitors prepared to leave. Before departing, they asked whether they could return. The family hesitated. 40 years of isolation could not disappear during a single afternoon. Eventually, they agreed. The strangers walked back into the forest, leaving behind several supplies and an enormous collection of questions. The family watched until the last person vanished among the trees. Then they returned to the cabin. That night, conversation continued long after darkness covered the valley. For perhaps the first time in decades, the family discussed the outside world not as a threat from the past, but as a place that actually existed in the present. The younger members wanted to know more. What did modern towns look like? How many people lived there? What had happened to the places their parents remembered? Could they visit and return? Were there relatives somewhere beyond the mountains? The older generation was more hesitant. Learning that the war had ended did not erase 40 years of caution. There was also grief hidden inside the discovery. People they once knew were probably gone. Parents, siblings, childhood friends, neighbors, anyone they had expected to see after a temporary period of hiding would now be elderly or dead. Houses might have disappeared. Villages might have changed beyond recognition. The world they might have returned to no longer existed. One family member quietly asked the question everyone had been avoiding. If the war ended so long ago, why had they stayed? Nobody answered. There was no single explanation. Fear had started the isolation. Distance had maintained it. Lack of information had strengthened it. Habit had eventually transformed it into normal life. They had not awakened one morning and chosen to sacrifice 40 years. They had chosen to remain one more winter, then one more year, then another, until 4 decades had disappeared. Before sleeping, the old man stepped outside. The forest looked exactly as it had the night before. The river continued moving through the darkness. The same mountains surrounded the valley. Nothing physical had changed. Yet everything was different. For most of his life, those mountains had protected his family from a dangerous world. Now he understood something far more difficult. For decades, they had also prevented his family from discovering that the danger was gone. And soon, the visitors would return carrying something more unsettling than any weapon the family had ever feared. They would bring photographs of the modern world. When the visitors returned, they carried something far more powerful than explanations. They brought photographs. For people who had lived through the gradual transformation of the modern world, the images would have appeared ordinary. Crowded streets, tall buildings, automobiles, airplanes, electric lights, stores filled with manufactured goods, and homes containing technologies that had become part of everyday life. But the family had not experienced that transformation gradually. Their understanding of civilization had effectively stopped when they entered the wilderness. Now 40 years of change were being placed before them all at once. The younger members gathered closest. Some had never seen a real city. They knew such places existed because their parents had described them, but those descriptions were based on memories from decades earlier. The photographs showed something completely different. Roads were wider. Vehicles looked unfamiliar. Buildings seemed impossibly large. Crowds filled public spaces with a density that made the family uncomfortable even when viewed on paper. One photograph showed a city at night illuminated by thousands of electric lights. Someone asked whether a celebration was taking place. The visitor explained that the city looked like that every night. The family stared at the photograph again. Every night. That detail alone seemed difficult to comprehend. Darkness governed their lives. When sunlight disappeared, work became harder and travel through the forest more dangerous. Fire provided warmth and limited illumination, but fuel required labor. The idea that entire streets could remain brightly illuminated after sunset sounded almost extravagant. The visitors showed them another image. An airplane. The family immediately recognized the general shape because they had occasionally seen aircraft overhead. But the photograph revealed its enormous size. They learned that ordinary civilians traveled inside such machines, crossing distances in hours that would have required the family weeks or months on foot. Some aircraft could cross oceans. The older generation listened carefully but reacted with less excitement. Each technological achievement seemed to confirm how unfamiliar the outside world had become. Returning no longer meant simply walking back toward the society they remembered. That society was gone. Then came the automobiles. The family understood motor vehicles from their earlier lives, but modern versions appeared strange. The younger members, who had little or no direct memory of vehicles, asked basic questions that surprised the visitors. How fast could they travel? Where did they obtain fuel? How could so many vehicles move through cities without constantly colliding? The visitors answered patiently, increasingly aware that they were not merely describing machines. They were explaining the basic structure of modern existence. One object created more fascination than almost anything else. A television. The visitors had brought a small portable device capable of displaying recorded images. When it was turned on, the family initially treated the moving picture with suspicion. Human figures appeared on a flat surface, speaking and moving as though a tiny world existed inside the machine. The younger members moved closer. The older ones watched from a distance. They had seen reflections in water and mirrors. They understood photographs. But moving images accompanied by sound created an entirely different reaction. The visitors explained that people throughout the world watched events through devices like this. News, entertainment, speeches, sports, and images from distant countries could enter a home almost instantly. Again, the irony was impossible to ignore. The family had spent decades separated from information, while millions of other people had gradually gained the ability to watch events happening thousands of kilometers away. Then the visitors showed them images of something even more astonishing. Human beings standing on the moon. At first, the family did not understand what they were seeing. The landscape looked barren and unfamiliar. The figure wore a strange suit. The visitors explained. A man had traveled to the moon. The family looked upward instinctively. The moon had been one of the few constants throughout their isolation. It crossed the same night sky above their cabin that it crossed above every city in the world. They had watched it while planting, hunting, traveling, and surviving winter after winter. To hear that human beings had built machines powerful enough to leave Earth and reach that distant object seemed almost beyond belief. One of the younger family members laughed, assuming the visitors were joking. They were not. The outsiders described rockets, satellites, and space exploration. They explained that machines now orbited the planet and helped with communication and observation. The family's understanding of distance was being dismantled piece by piece. But technology was only part of what they had missed. The visitors brought maps. The older man studied them carefully. Names had changed. Borders were different. Places he remembered still existed, but some had grown enormously. Roads crossed regions that had once been difficult to reach. Settlements appeared where he remembered almost nothing. Then he pointed toward the area where the family had lived before disappearing. He asked whether the old village still existed. The visitors did not know. That question led to another. What about the people who had lived there? Again, nobody could answer immediately. For the first time, the excitement surrounding the modern world disappeared from the cabin. The family had been fascinated by machines because machines represented progress without emotional consequences. But the map reminded them that history involved people. Somewhere outside the valley might be the descendants of relatives who had assumed they were dead. The older generation began naming people. Brothers, sisters, friends, neighbors. They asked the visitors whether there was any way to discover what had happened to them. The answer was yes. Records existed. Communities could be contacted. Searches could be made. The possibility transformed the family's relationship with the visitors. Until then, outsiders had represented civilization entering their valley. Now they could become a bridge to the lives left behind. The old man provided names and locations as accurately as memory allowed. Some details were uncertain. 4 decades had blurred dates and spellings. But the visitors wrote everything down. Before leaving, they promised to investigate. The family waited. For people accustomed to measuring time through seasons, several days should have meant little. Yet those days felt unusually long. Every aircraft sound brought someone outside. Every movement near the trees caused attention to shift toward the forest. Eventually, the visitors returned. This time, they carried information rather than photographs. Some of the people the family remembered had died many years earlier. Others had moved away. A few names could not be traced. But there were survivors. And there were descendants. People who shared their family name were still living beyond the wilderness. For decades, those relatives had believed the missing family was dead. The revelation produced an emotion no photograph of a city or machine could match. The isolated family had spent 40 years believing they had escaped from the world. The world had spent 40 years believing they had disappeared from it forever. Now both sides knew the truth. And for the first time since entering the wilderness, someone inside the cabin seriously suggested something that once would have been unthinkable. Perhaps they should leave the valley. Not permanently. Just long enough to see what had become of the world they had abandoned. The idea divided the family immediately. Some wanted to go. Others refused. Because discovering that the war was over was one thing. Walking back into civilization after 40 years was something entirely different. The invitation sounded simple. Come with us and see the outside world. The visitors explained that nobody intended to force the family to abandon their home. They could travel to a nearby settlement, receive medical examinations, obtain supplies, perhaps meet relatives, and return to the valley afterward if that was what they wanted. To the outsiders, it seemed like a reasonable first step. To the family, it represented the crossing of a boundary that had defined their lives for more than 40 years. They had spent decades believing that survival depended on remaining exactly where they were. Now they were being asked to walk voluntarily toward the place they had been taught to fear. The family debated the proposal for days. The younger members were the most curious. They wanted to see roads, vehicles, stores, electric lights, and the other things shown in the photographs. They wanted to meet people who were somehow related to them but whom they had never known existed. The outside world frightened them, but it also promised answers. The older generation remained cautious. Their concerns were practical as much as emotional. What would happen if they became sick? What if authorities refused to let them return? What if the visitors had misunderstood their situation? What if civilization itself was simply too different? Medical care became one of the strongest arguments for leaving temporarily. Years of isolation had taught the family how to handle minor injuries and common illnesses with the resources available to them, but they had almost no access to modern medicine. Serious sickness had always been one of the greatest threats in the valley. The visitors explained that doctors could examine them and perhaps identify problems that could not be treated in isolation. Eventually, several family members agreed to make the journey. Preparations began immediately, although nobody knew exactly how to prepare for entering a world 40 years ahead of them. They selected their best clothing, much of it repaired countless times. Personal belongings were kept to a minimum. The visitors offered modern garments, but some family members preferred familiar clothes. Wearing something made by their own hands gave them a small sense of control. Then came the moment of departure. They stood outside the cabin and looked back at the settlement. For the visitors, it was a collection of crude structures surrounded by cultivated land. For the family, it was 4 decades of life. Children had grown there. Winters had been survived there. Meals had been shared there. Arguments, celebrations, losses, and ordinary days had accumulated until the valley contained nearly every memory they possessed. Leaving it, even temporarily, felt like stepping away from reality. The journey itself immediately revealed how different the outside world had become. When they reached transportation arranged by the visitors, some family members hesitated before approaching. The machine was far more advanced than the vehicles remembered by the oldest generation. The younger members examined every detail. Doors, seats, windows, controls, objects completely ordinary to millions of people became subjects of intense curiosity. When the engine started, several of them instinctively tensed. Then the vehicle moved. The forest began passing outside the windows at a speed impossible on foot. Familiar distances collapsed. A journey that might have required days of difficult walking could now be completed in hours. At first, everyone watched silently. Then the road improved. The rough track became a wider road. Other vehicles appeared. One passed in the opposite direction, and several family members turned immediately to watch it disappear behind them. Then another appeared. And another. Soon there were too many to count. For the first time, the scale of modern civilization began to reveal itself. Utility poles appeared beside the road. Buildings became more frequent. Agricultural fields stretched across land that looked impossibly organized compared with their small plots in the valley. Machines worked fields with an efficiency that left the family staring through the windows. Then they reached the edge of a town. The reaction was immediate. People everywhere. Pedestrians walked along streets. Vehicles stopped and moved according to signals. Storefronts displayed objects behind enormous windows. Signs covered buildings. Electrical wires crossed overhead. The noise alone was overwhelming. Engines, voices, horns, machinery, doors opening and closing, music coming from somewhere nearby. The younger members tried to look in every direction at once. The older ones became quieter. Nothing resembled the civilization preserved in their memories. They passed a supermarket. Through the windows, rows of products could be seen beneath bright electric lights. The family had spent decades measuring food carefully, preserving every harvest, and worrying about whether supplies would survive until spring. Now they were looking at a building containing more food than they could imagine consuming. When they eventually entered a store, the experience became even stranger. Shelves extended down long aisles. Fruit appeared in varieties they had never seen. Packaged foods came from distant regions. Sugar, flour, salt, coffee, canned goods, soap, clothing, tools, and countless other products could simply be selected and purchased. One family member picked up a packaged item and examined the wrapper longer than the food itself. The packaging seemed almost absurd. In the valley, containers were valuable. Cloth was valuable. Metal was valuable. Even string could be saved and reused. Here, people opened packages and threw them away. That realization disturbed the older generation more than the abundance impressed them. Modern civilization appeared incredibly wealthy and incredibly wasteful at the same time. Their next destination was a medical clinic. The building itself produced another wave of unfamiliar experiences. Electric lighting filled every room. Water emerged immediately from taps. Equipment displayed numbers and produced sounds. Doctors and nurses wore unfamiliar clothing and used instruments the family had never encountered. The examinations revealed the consequences of isolation. Years of demanding physical work had made them resilient in some ways, but the absence of medical care had allowed treatable problems to persist. Dental conditions that could have been addressed easily had become permanent. Old injuries had healed without professional treatment. Nutritional limitations had left their marks. Yet doctors were also surprised by aspects of their physical condition. Constant movement and a life without many modern processed foods had produced certain advantages. Their bodies told the same complicated story as their settlement. Isolation had protected them from some things while exposing them severely to others. Then came something far more emotional than the medical examinations. The visitors had located relatives. A meeting was arranged. The family waited inside a modest room, visibly nervous. They understood that the people about to enter shared their blood, but emotionally they were strangers. More than 40 years separated their lives. The door opened. An elderly person entered slowly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The oldest member of the isolated family stared at the visitor's face. Age had transformed it almost beyond recognition, but something remained familiar. A feature around the eyes. The shape of the face. A gesture. Then a name was spoken. Recognition came gradually, followed by disbelief. Someone they had last seen as a young person was now old. They moved toward each other. No explanation could restore the missing decades. There were too many questions and too many people who could no longer answer them. But for a brief moment, the outside world stopped being an abstraction filled with machines and strangers. It became family again. They talked for hours. The relatives explained what had happened after the disappearance. Searches had been made. Rumors had circulated. Some believed the family had died in the wilderness. Others thought they had crossed into another region. Eventually, with no evidence, most people accepted that they would never return. Then the isolated family heard the names of those who had waited for them. Some had died believing they were gone forever. That knowledge was difficult to absorb. For the first time, the cost of isolation could be measured not only in years but in relationships. The family had survived. But survival had not preserved everything. That evening, they were offered comfortable rooms with beds, running water, heating, and electricity. By modern standards, the accommodations were ordinary. To people accustomed to a wooden cabin, they seemed almost impossibly luxurious. Yet something unexpected happened. Several family members could not sleep. The mattress felt too soft. The building made unfamiliar sounds. Lights from outside entered through the windows. Vehicles continued moving long after darkness. Civilization, which had appeared miraculous during the day, became exhausting at night. They missed the forest. They missed the river. They missed the silence. And before their first visit to the modern world was even over, some had already made a surprising decision. They wanted to go home. The visitors had expected the family to be amazed by civilization, and they were. What nobody had fully anticipated was how quickly amazement could become exhaustion. Everything demanded attention. Doors opened automatically. Machines produced unfamiliar sounds. Vehicles moved at speeds that made crossing a street feel dangerous. Strangers passed within centimeters of one another without speaking. Advertisements covered walls and storefronts. Radios, televisions, engines, telephones, and conversations created a constant background of noise. For people accustomed to hearing wind, water, birds, footsteps, and the occasional crack of timber in a fire, the modern town seemed almost incapable of silence. The younger members adapted more quickly. Curiosity helped overcome discomfort. They wanted to understand how everything worked. They watched people use telephones, examined household appliances, learned how electric switches controlled lights, and stared through store windows at objects whose purposes were not immediately obvious. Yet even they struggled with the speed of modern life. In the valley, tasks were physically difficult but conceptually simple. If they needed heat, they gathered wood. If they needed food, they planted, hunted, preserved, or cooked. If something broke, they repaired it. Civilization replaced many of those physical challenges with systems they did not understand. Money, documents, schedules, regulations, transportation networks, addresses, medical appointments, identification records. The invisible structure surrounding ordinary modern life was more confusing than any machine. Money was particularly strange. The family understood the basic concept from memories passed down by the older generation, but decades of self-sufficiency had made currency almost irrelevant to their existence. In the valley, value was direct. A sharp tool had value because it could cut. Seeds had value because they could become food. A warm garment had value because winter could kill. In town, people exchanged pieces of paper or numbers recorded by institutions for objects produced by strangers hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. The system worked efficiently, but to the family it required an extraordinary amount of trust. One afternoon, they were taken through a busy commercial district. The younger members watched enormous quantities of goods moving in and out of stores. Food was available regardless of season. Clothing existed in more styles than they could understand. Tools were manufactured with precision their own handmade equipment could never match. Yet the older members repeatedly asked the same question: what happened if all of this stopped? The visitors initially thought they meant a temporary power failure. They did not. The family was asking what happened if the entire system failed. Where would people find food if stores became empty? How many could grow their own crops? Who could repair their belongings without replacement parts? Where would water come from if machines stopped delivering it? Those questions revealed the enormous difference between the two worlds. Modern people had built systems so reliable that they rarely needed to think about the individual steps keeping them alive. The isolated family had spent decades thinking about almost nothing else. Every winter had required preparation. Every meal represented labor. Every tool was connected directly to survival. Civilization offered extraordinary comfort, but from the family's perspective it also created dependencies they found unsettling. Their discomfort became more obvious when strangers began recognizing them. News of the isolated family had spread. People wanted to see them, ask questions, photograph them, and hear how they had survived. Some approached with genuine kindness. Others treated them almost like visitors from another historical era. The attention embarrassed the family. For more than 40 years, they had deliberately avoided being noticed. Now their faces and story attracted curiosity everywhere they went. The older man disliked it intensely. He had never considered himself extraordinary. He had made decisions he believed necessary to protect his family and then spent decades doing ordinary work under extraordinary circumstances. Hunting, planting, repairing, building, surviving winter. None of these things seemed remarkable to him. Yet people now looked at his family as though they were living artifacts from the past. Questions sometimes made the situation worse. Did they know what television was? Had they ever seen a refrigerator? Did they understand airplanes? Had they heard about famous historical events? Each question reminded them of another piece of the world they had missed. The family slowly realized that 40 years could not be recovered simply by receiving information. Someone could tell them who had become president, which wars had started and ended, which technologies had been invented, which famous people had lived and died, and which countries had changed. But knowing facts was different from having lived through those decades. The outside world possessed a shared memory they did not have. People laughed at references the family could not understand. Songs considered old classics were completely new to them. Historical events described as unforgettable meant nothing. Even language had changed. New expressions had appeared. Words connected to technologies and social changes had entered ordinary conversation. They were surrounded by people speaking a language they technically understood while constantly referring to a culture they had never experienced. The emotional distance was enormous. Then came another difficulty: time. In the wilderness, their schedule had been controlled largely by nature. Sunrise began the working day. Weather determined which tasks were possible. Seasons dictated priorities. Exact minutes rarely mattered. Civilization divided life into precise units. Appointments began at specific times. Transportation departed according to schedules. Stores opened and closed according to clocks. People frequently looked at watches as though a few minutes could change everything. One younger family member reportedly became fascinated by the idea that so many people seemed to be rushing even when they were not facing an obvious danger. Where were they going? Why did they need to arrive so quickly? The visitors tried to explain work schedules, appointments, business hours, and modern responsibilities. The answer did not make civilization seem more attractive. After several days, the family's request became clear. They wanted to return to the valley. Some outsiders were surprised. Why choose a cabin without electricity, modern plumbing, medical facilities, or convenient transportation after seeing what civilization could offer? But the family did not view the decision as rejecting progress. They were choosing familiarity. In the valley, they knew who they were. They knew where water came from. They knew which plants could grow. They knew how much firewood winter required. They knew the sounds of animals moving through darkness. They knew every path surrounding their home. In civilization, almost everything required someone else's explanation. The visitors respected the decision. Before the return journey, however, they offered supplies. The family accepted some cautiously: stronger tools, clothing, containers, medical necessities, and practical objects that could improve life without fundamentally changing it. They rejected other things. Technology that required electricity or regular replacement had little purpose in the valley. Their choices fascinated the outsiders. Given access to decades of technological progress, the family selected mostly simple objects. A durable axe mattered more than a television. A metal cooking pot mattered more than entertainment. Good fabric mattered more than fashionable clothing. Seeds mattered more than almost anything. They were evaluating the modern world according to a completely different definition of value. Then they traveled back. As buildings became less frequent and roads narrower, the family visibly relaxed. The noise faded. Traffic disappeared. Forest replaced concrete. Eventually, they continued through terrain no ordinary vehicle could cross. When the cabin finally appeared between the trees, their reaction answered any remaining question about where they considered home. They had returned. That evening, they lit the familiar fire. There was no electric switch, no television, no traffic outside, only flames, conversation, and darkness beyond the walls. But their isolation could never again be what it had been. They now knew the truth about the war. They knew relatives existed beyond the forest. They knew human beings had reached the moon. They knew cities glowed through the night and information could cross continents almost instantly. The valley was still physically isolated. Their minds were not. And that created a new question. If the family intended to remain in the wilderness, how much of the modern world should they allow to enter with them? After the family returned, the valley looked unchanged, but their relationship with it had changed completely. For more than 40 years, isolation had been absolute. Every object they possessed had either entered the wilderness with the original generation or been created, repaired, adapted, and reused from materials available around them. Now modern tools rested beside handmade ones. New fabric appeared beside clothing patched countless times. Metal containers replaced some objects that had required constant repair. Medicines were stored carefully inside the cabin. Small changes had arrived, but each one represented something much larger. The family was no longer completely separated from civilization. The visitors continued returning. At first, every arrival remained an event. The family would hear movement beyond the settlement and stop whatever they were doing. Decades of caution could not disappear immediately. But gradually, the reaction softened. The outsiders were no longer mysterious figures emerging from a dangerous world. Some became familiar faces. They learned where to stand without disturbing the family's work, which questions caused discomfort, and which supplies were genuinely useful. Trust developed slowly, not through promises, but through repetition. One of the greatest changes involved information. The family no longer had to wonder what existed beyond the mountains. Visitors brought newspapers, photographs, maps, and explanations. News that once would have taken decades to reach them could now arrive during the next visit. Yet absorbing it was difficult. Imagine opening a history book and discovering that almost every page described something that happened during your own lifetime without your knowledge. Political crises had come and gone. Famous leaders had died. New countries had emerged. Technologies had transformed society. Cultural movements had changed how people dressed, worked, communicated, and understood the world. The younger members wanted to know everything. They asked questions for hours. The older generation was more selective. Some information seemed useful. Much of it seemed distant from the practical realities of life in the valley. Knowing what was happening in a faraway city did not change when crops needed planting. Understanding international politics did not repair a leaking roof. The wilderness had taught them to judge knowledge partly by whether it could be applied. Still, certain discoveries transformed daily life almost immediately. Better metal tools reduced hours of physical labor. A modern saw could accomplish work that previously demanded enormous effort. Strong containers protected food from moisture and animals. Improved clothing made severe weather easier to endure. Simple medical supplies could prevent a small injury from becoming dangerous. But the family resisted adopting everything. They had seen enough of civilization to understand that convenience could create dependence. If they accepted a machine requiring fuel that could only be obtained outside the valley, they would need regular contact. If they adopted technology that broke without specialized parts, they would depend on visitors to repair it. Their goal was not to recreate a modern town in the wilderness. They wanted to remain capable of surviving if outsiders stopped coming. This produced a strange mixture of eras. A modern manufactured axe might hang on the wall of a cabin built using techniques passed down for generations. Medicine could sit beside traditional remedies. New clothing could be worn while planting crops using methods learned decades earlier. The family was not frozen in the past anymore, but neither had it fully entered the present. The visitors found this balance fascinating. Some outsiders initially imagined the family would abandon the valley once they understood what civilization offered. Instead, the opposite occurred. Modern knowledge sometimes strengthened their appreciation for the life they had created. They understood its hardships better than anyone, but they also recognized what they possessed: silence, space, independence, direct connection to their food, and a sense of purpose built around survival and family. Yet contact also brought risks the family had never needed to consider. Their isolation had protected them from many common illnesses circulating through larger populations. Increased contact meant exposure. Visitors therefore had to become more careful, particularly around vulnerable family members. Modern medicine could help, but the sudden arrival of unfamiliar diseases into a small isolated group could have serious consequences. There were psychological risks as well. The younger generation began comparing their lives with what they had seen outside. Some wondered what education might have been available to them. Others imagined professions, friendships, or relationships that could never develop in such an isolated place. The valley that had always seemed enormous suddenly appeared smaller after they learned how large the world really was. One family member became particularly interested in returning to civilization for longer periods. This created tension. The older generation feared that once someone left permanently, the family structure would begin to disappear. Their survival had always depended on cooperation. Every person had responsibilities. Losing one capable adult could mean more work for everyone else. But the younger members faced a different question. Had they chosen this life? Their parents and grandparents had entered the wilderness because of war. Some younger members had been born there long after the war ended. They had inherited isolation without making the decision themselves. Now, for the first time, they had a choice. The visitors understood that this question could not be answered for them. Some family members wanted more contact. Others wanted less. Some viewed civilization as opportunity. Others viewed it as distraction. The debate became part of life in the valley. Then another development changed everything again. The family's story began spreading beyond the local region. Journalists became interested. Researchers wanted interviews. People who had never visited the wilderness heard about a family that had apparently lived for decades beyond ordinary society. Requests began arriving. Could photographers visit? Could journalists document the settlement? Would the family travel to speak about their experiences? The attention made them deeply uncomfortable. They had spent most of their lives avoiding discovery. Now strangers wanted to transform their privacy into a story. The family refused many requests. Those they accepted came with boundaries. Visitors could not simply arrive whenever they wanted. The settlement was not an attraction. Their home was not a museum. They were people who had survived an unusual circumstance, not characters created for public entertainment. Yet public fascination continued growing. Why? Perhaps because their story forced outsiders to imagine an impossible question. What if you disappeared today and returned 40 years from now? Which technologies would seem incomprehensible? Which people would still be alive? Which beliefs would have vanished? Would your hometown look familiar? Would you even understand the society around you? The family's isolation had turned them into accidental time travelers. They had not moved forward through time faster than everyone else. They had simply remained still while the world moved around them. And as more people learned their story, one question appeared repeatedly. How had they actually survived 40 years without civilization? The answer was more complicated than hunting and farming. Their survival depended on a system developed slowly across thousands of ordinary days. And when outsiders began documenting that system, they discovered just how close the family had sometimes come to disappearing forever. From the outside, the family's survival could appear almost romantic: a cabin surrounded by wilderness, food gathered from the land, evenings beside a fire, and a life untouched by the pressures of modern society. But the reality was far harsher. Isolation did not create simplicity. It transferred nearly every responsibility normally shared by thousands of people onto the shoulders of a single family. There were no stores when food ran low, no repair shops when tools broke, no doctors when someone became ill, no emergency services after an accident, and no neighbor close enough to help during a crisis. Every season required preparation because nature offered very little forgiveness. Food was the foundation of everything. The family could not depend entirely on hunting because success was unpredictable. They needed crops capable of surviving difficult conditions, and over the years they learned which parts of the valley produced the best harvests. Seeds were treated almost like treasure. Losing an entire crop was not merely disappointing, it could threaten survival months later. Planting, therefore, became one of the most important events of the year. Everyone who could work participated. Soil was prepared with limited tools, weeds were removed by hand, and every useful plant was protected carefully. Harvest brought relief, but it also created another problem: preservation. Without refrigeration, food had to survive through traditional methods and careful storage. Vegetables were kept in conditions designed to slow decay. Other foods could be dried or preserved. Nothing was discarded casually. Portions that might seem insignificant in a modern kitchen could become important during the final weeks of winter. Hunting supplemented their diet, but it demanded enormous knowledge. The family learned animal movements, seasonal patterns, tracks, weather behavior, and the geography surrounding the valley. Children were taught these skills gradually. Survival knowledge was their education. They learned where water remained accessible during freezing conditions, which areas became dangerous after heavy rain, how to recognize changing weather, how to navigate without marked roads, and how to return home when familiar landmarks disappeared beneath snow. Failure taught some of the most important lessons. There were winters when food became dangerously scarce. A harvest could fail because of unexpected weather. Animals could damage crops. Stored food could spoil. Hunting might become difficult for weeks. During those periods, the family reduced portions and stretched supplies as far as possible. Hunger was not an abstract fear. It was something they understood physically. The cold created another constant threat. Firewood had to be gathered long before winter. Waiting until temperatures dropped would be too late. Trees were cut, divided, transported, and stored while conditions were still manageable. The amount required was enormous because fire was responsible for more than comfort. It provided heat, cooking, light, and the ability to dry wet clothing. Losing fire during severe weather could become dangerous quickly. Their cabin, therefore, demanded constant attention. Roof damage had to be repaired before storms. Walls needed reinforcement. Openings had to be sealed against wind. Timber deteriorated and required replacement. Over 40 years, the structure changed repeatedly. Parts were rebuilt so many times that the cabin became less a single building than a living project passed from one season to another. Clothing was equally important. There was no possibility of replacing a damaged garment by purchasing another. Fabric became increasingly precious as the years passed. Clothing was repaired until the original material could be difficult to distinguish beneath patches. Older garments were transformed into material for other purposes. Nothing was thrown away while it retained even the smallest practical use. Metal presented a greater challenge. The family could work with wood, leather, bone, and other natural materials, but producing high-quality metal tools from nothing was far more difficult. Every axe head, blade, needle, and piece of metal carried into isolation therefore had enormous long-term importance. A broken handle could be replaced. A lost metal component might be gone forever. Tools were maintained carefully. Blades were sharpened repeatedly. Metal pieces were reused. Nails were removed from damaged wood, straightened, and driven again. When an object finally became unusable in its original form, the family looked for another purpose. This habit of reuse eventually became instinctive. The modern concept of disposable goods had almost no meaning in the valley. Objects were not temporary conveniences. They were resources. But the most dangerous moments came when someone became sick or injured. A cut could become infected. A broken bone could leave someone unable to work during a critical season. Dental problems could become severe. Illnesses that modern medicine might treat routinely had to be endured with limited remedies and whatever knowledge the family possessed. They learned caution. An unnecessary risk was never merely personal. If one adult became unable to work, everyone else inherited that person's responsibilities. Survival depended on the group. This created a powerful culture of cooperation. Tasks were divided according to ability rather than preference. Younger members learned by observing older ones. Knowledge was repeated until it became automatic. Nobody needed written instructions explaining how to prepare for winter because preparation was woven into the rhythm of life. Morning began with immediate responsibilities. Animals or traps might need checking. Water had to be collected. Fire maintained. Food prepared. Fields inspected. Repairs completed. The wilderness did not provide weekends. Yet there were also long periods of ordinary family life. They told stories. They remembered people from the world they had left. They celebrated small successes. Children played with objects made from available materials. They watched seasons change. They argued and reconciled. Isolation did not remove the ordinary complexity of family relationships. It intensified it. There was nowhere else to go after an argument. Cooperation had to continue because tomorrow's work remained. As decades passed, the oldest generation transferred responsibility to the younger one. This transition was essential. The family could not depend forever on the people who remembered civilization. Younger members became better hunters, builders, farmers, and navigators. Eventually, some of them understood the valley more deeply than the people who had originally chosen it. But with each passing generation, another kind of knowledge disappeared. Memories of the outside world. The oldest family members remembered streets, shops, neighbors, schools, and communities. The younger ones knew those things mostly through stories. If discovery had come another generation later, the connection might have been even weaker. Researchers and visitors eventually realized something unsettling. The family had survived partly because several circumstances had aligned in their favor. The valley offered water. The soil could produce enough food. The forest supplied fuel and materials. The family possessed enough practical knowledge to adapt. They had carried certain essential tools. And perhaps most importantly, they had one another. Change any of those factors and the story might have ended differently. A serious accident. Several failed harvests. A severe illness. A catastrophic fire. Any one of them could have destroyed the fragile system. The family had not conquered the wilderness. They had negotiated with it every day for 40 years. And the price of failure was always close. This was why the modern world's fascination sometimes confused them. Outsiders saw independence. The family remembered hunger. Outsiders saw freedom. They remembered fear. Outsiders imagined peaceful isolation. They remembered winters when survival was uncertain. Their story was not proof that civilization was unnecessary. If anything, it demonstrated how much invisible support civilization normally provides. Yet the family had achieved something extraordinary. Against enormous odds, they had remained alive long enough for the world to find them again. But survival had come with losses that could never be repaired. And when the family finally began speaking openly about those missing decades, it became clear that the greatest cost of isolation was not technological. It was human. Of everything the family discovered after contact with the outside world, nothing affected them as deeply as learning what had happened to the people they left behind. Technology could be explained. Machines could be demonstrated. History could be summarized through dates, photographs, maps, and books. But no explanation could restore a person who had died believing that the missing family would never return. 40 years could be described, but they could not be recovered. When the family first disappeared, relatives had no clear explanation for what had happened. Some knew they were frightened by the conflict, but few understood exactly where they intended to go. The wilderness was enormous. Searching every valley, river, and forest would have been impossible. For a while, people hoped they would return when conditions improved. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, hope weakened. Perhaps the family had died while traveling. Perhaps they had crossed into another region. Perhaps they had been caught in the violence they were trying to escape. Different explanations circulated because nobody possessed evidence. Then the war ended. Still, the family did not return. That silence convinced many relatives that something terrible must have happened. If they were alive, surely they would come home now that the danger was gone. But the hidden family did not know the danger was gone. The misunderstanding continued on both sides. Inside the valley, they believed returning might still expose them to war. Outside the valley, relatives interpreted their continued absence as evidence of death. Years passed. Searches ended. Families continued living because there was little else they could do. Children grew up hearing about relatives who had disappeared long before they were born. Photographs became the only physical connection. Names survived in conversations. Eventually, the missing family moved from recent tragedy into family history. Meanwhile, the people everyone believed dead were still alive. They were planting crops, repairing their cabin, collecting firewood, watching the same seasons pass. The distance separating them from their relatives was enormous in practical terms, but surprisingly small compared with the emotional distance created by missing information. When researchers began tracing the family's past, old records provided fragments. Names appeared in documents. Locations could be identified. Surviving relatives were contacted. Some initially refused to believe the news. After 4 decades, being told that people presumed dead had been discovered alive sounded impossible. Questions followed immediately. Where had they been? Why had they never returned? How could they have survived? Did they know the war had ended? That final question explained almost everything. No, they had not known. When reunions became possible, they were emotionally complicated. Recognition was not always immediate. A young sibling remembered from childhood might now be an elderly person. Children who had once played together now had grandchildren. Voices had changed. Faces carried decades of experiences the other side had never witnessed. Sometimes recognition came through tiny details. A familiar expression. A way of laughing. The shape of someone's hands. A childhood nickname remembered after 40 years. Those moments connected 2 timelines that had been separated for almost an entire lifetime. But every reunion also revealed absences. Someone would ask about a parent. The answer would come quietly. Gone. Another name. Gone. A childhood friend. Gone years ago. Each answer removed another possibility the isolated family had perhaps carried without realizing it. The outside world had continued aging while their memories remained young. The oldest family members struggled most with this. They remembered people as they had looked on the day of departure. Mothers and fathers remained frozen at a particular age in memory. Brothers and sisters remained young. Friends remained standing in familiar places. Now they learned how those lives had ended. Some relatives had waited years for news. Others had died never knowing what happened. That knowledge created a kind of grief delayed by decades. The family had never attended the funerals. They had never said goodbye. They had not been present during illnesses, marriages, births, celebrations, or crises. They had survived physically while losing almost every ordinary connection that ties a person to a larger community. One of the younger members experienced the discovery differently. He had no memories of those people. To him, the names represented strangers connected through blood. He could sympathize with the older generation, but he could not feel the same loss. His entire emotional world existed inside the valley. This difference created an important realization. The family no longer belonged entirely to the society their parents had left. But they did not belong entirely to the wilderness either. They existed between worlds. The older generation carried memories of a society that no longer existed. The younger generation carried memories of isolation that outsiders could barely understand. Their relatives belonged to the modern world. Rebuilding those relationships required more than a reunion. It required learning how to become family again. Visits continued. Stories were exchanged. Old photographs were brought to the valley. Names were connected to faces. Family trees were reconstructed. Younger relatives listened as the isolated family described people they had known decades earlier. Sometimes the situation reversed. The supposedly missing family possessed memories of grandparents or great-grandparents that younger descendants had never met. Their isolation had accidentally preserved pieces of family history. Stories forgotten elsewhere remained alive inside the cabin because the family had repeated them for generations. The exchange therefore moved in both directions. Civilization told the isolated family what had happened during the missing decades. The isolated family told civilization what had existed before them. Yet one question remained difficult. Did the older generation regret leaving? There was no simple answer. At the moment of departure, fear had been real. Nobody could know exactly what would have happened if they had stayed. Perhaps leaving had saved them. Perhaps it had not. History rarely allows people to see the alternative version of their lives. What they could say with certainty was that they regretted not knowing sooner. If someone had reached them years earlier with reliable information, perhaps they would have returned. Perhaps children would have attended school. Perhaps relatives would have been reunited while parents were still alive. Perhaps 40 years would not have disappeared. But regret could not change the past. The family had spent decades surviving because they believed survival required isolation. Now their challenge was different. They needed to decide what kind of future they wanted. Some relatives encouraged them to leave the valley permanently. A home could be arranged. Medical care would be nearby. The younger generation could study and work. Life could become easier. The offer was generous. And once again, the family gathered to discuss whether they should abandon the place that had protected and imprisoned them for most of their lives. This time, however, the decision would not be made because of fear. For the first time, they could choose freely. For the first time in more than 40 years, the family could make a decision about the valley without war influencing the answer. They knew the truth now. Nobody was hunting them. The roads beyond the forest were open. Relatives were waiting. Civilization offered hospitals, electricity, reliable food, transportation, education, and comforts they had spent most of their lives without. If they wanted to leave, they could. Yet freedom created a problem that fear had never allowed them to confront. After so many years, where did they actually belong? The older members answered first. The valley was home. That statement surprised some outsiders, who continued to see the settlement primarily through its hardships. The cabin lacked conveniences considered basic in modern society. Winter remained dangerous. Medical emergencies could become serious because of distance. Every meal required work somewhere along the chain of survival. But the older family members did not compare their home with a modern apartment or house. They compared it with the life they knew. Every tree line, stream, path, and slope carried memories. They knew where sunlight reached the garden first in spring. They knew which parts of the river became dangerous after heavy rain. They knew where animals crossed during particular seasons and where snow accumulated deepest during winter. Civilization offered convenience, but the valley offered mastery. Here, they understood how to live. The younger generation faced a more difficult choice. They had seen enough of the outside world to understand what isolation had denied them. Education was perhaps the most obvious example. Their parents had taught them practical knowledge extraordinarily well, but formal schooling could provide access to subjects and possibilities unavailable in the wilderness. Some wanted to learn more about history, science, machinery, and medicine. Others were fascinated by the idea of work that did not revolve entirely around obtaining food, fuel, shelter, and basic necessities. Then there was companionship. A tiny isolated family offered very few possibilities for building independent social lives. In civilization, the younger members encountered people their own age with experiences completely different from theirs. Friendship itself could become a reason to leave. The family therefore began considering a compromise. They did not need to choose permanently between civilization and isolation. Some members could travel. Others could remain. Visits could connect the two worlds. Modern supplies could reduce certain risks without transforming the valley completely. It was an arrangement their younger selves could never have imagined. For decades, their worldview had contained only two possibilities: remain hidden and survive, or return and face danger. Now they understood there were countless possibilities between those extremes. The first extended departures were difficult. When a younger family member remained outside the valley longer than usual, the older generation worried. They knew intellectually that civilization was safe, but emotional habits built over 40 years were harder to change. A late return could awaken fears that belonged to another era. Gradually, those fears weakened. People left. They returned. Nothing terrible happened. The outside world stopped being an enemy territory and became simply another place. At the same time, the younger members discovered that civilization was not automatically easier in every sense. Physical survival demanded less daily effort, but modern life introduced different challenges. Money had to be earned. Documents had to be obtained. Rules had to be understood. Education required catching up on knowledge most people acquired during childhood. Social behavior contained unwritten expectations that were difficult to learn from explanations alone. Imagine being an adult and encountering ordinary institutions for the first time. A bank, a school, a government office, a public transportation system, a telephone. Each required learning not only what the object or institution did, but how people were expected to behave around it. Mistakes were inevitable. Some outsiders were patient. Others were less understanding. The family story attracted attention, and that attention occasionally made adaptation harder. They wanted to learn ordinary life while people around them viewed them as extraordinary. For this reason, the valley remained a refuge in a new sense. Originally, it had protected them from war. Now it protected them from attention. Returning to the cabin meant returning to a place where nobody needed to explain who they were. The modern world could be visited. The valley could remain home. Over time, practical improvements made this arrangement easier. Better communication reduced the danger of complete isolation. Medical assistance could be requested when necessary. Supplies could arrive periodically. Family members could maintain contact with relatives without permanently relocating. But one member remained deeply resistant to modernization. For him, every new object represented a potential chain connecting the family to systems beyond their control. He accepted tools that could be maintained locally. He accepted medicine because its value was obvious. But unnecessary technology held little attraction. Why bring a machine into the cabin simply because people elsewhere considered it normal? This question forced visitors to reconsider their own assumptions. Modern society often treats technological adoption as inevitable. New replaces old because it is faster, easier, or more efficient. The family judged technology differently. Does it solve a real problem? Can we maintain it? Does it make us more independent or less? What happens when it breaks? Those questions came directly from 40 years of survival. Nothing entered their lives without consequences. Eventually, the family reached its decision. They would not abandon the valley entirely. Those who wished to experience civilization could do so. Those who wanted to remain could remain. Contact would continue. The old absolute isolation was over, but their home would survive. For the outsiders, this decision might have seemed strange. For the family, it was logical. They had spent decades believing the wilderness was their only option. Now they chose it while knowing alternatives existed. That distinction mattered. Isolation imposed by fear had become solitude chosen with knowledge. Years earlier, the family had entered the forest looking over their shoulders, convinced that danger followed behind them. Now they could stand outside the same cabin and watch visitors leave without fearing what existed beyond the mountains. But there was still one final question surrounding their extraordinary story. How could an entire family remain hidden for more than 40 years in a world increasingly mapped, connected, photographed, and explored? The answer revealed something remarkable about the wilderness itself. They had not been thousands of years removed from civilization. They had been living in the same historical moment as everyone else. And yet, for decades, they had effectively vanished from the map. Looking at a modern map, it can be difficult to imagine how an entire family could disappear for more than 40 years. Roads cross continents. Aircraft travel above remote landscapes. Satellites observe enormous areas of the planet. Communication reaches places once considered inaccessible. Yet the family's story demonstrates something easily forgotten. A location can exist on a map without anyone truly knowing what happens there. Vast wilderness does not need to be completely unexplored to hide human lives. It only needs to be difficult enough, distant enough, and unimportant enough that almost nobody has a reason to look closely. The family's valley possessed exactly those qualities. It was surrounded by terrain that discouraged casual travel. Reaching it required effort without offering an obvious reward. There were no important roads passing nearby, no major settlement drawing visitors, and no commercial reason for large numbers of people to enter the area. Hunters and travelers naturally preferred easier routes. Officials responsible for enormous territories had little reason to inspect every clearing hidden between mountains and forests. The family had chosen the location precisely because it seemed useless to everyone except people determined to disappear. Their behavior made discovery even less likely. They did not build large structures visible from great distances. They did not clear enormous fields. They produced little smoke compared with an industrial settlement. They created no road connecting their cabin with civilization. Their paths followed the landscape and gradually blended into the forest. From a distance, much of what they built looked like another irregular part of the wilderness. More importantly, nobody was searching for them forever. Immediately after a disappearance, people ask questions. Relatives search. Authorities may investigate. Communities remember. But years change priorities. Without evidence, searches eventually stop. People move away. Records become old. The missing become presumed dead. A mystery that once felt urgent becomes a story repeated occasionally by surviving relatives. That is one of the strangest elements of long-term disappearance. The hidden person does not need to remain impossible to find forever. They only need to remain hidden until most people stop looking. The family accomplished exactly that. As decades passed, civilization actually moved closer in indirect ways. Aircraft crossed the region more frequently. Better maps were produced. Exploration expanded. Technology made remote travel easier. Yet none of those developments automatically revealed the cabin. A map could show the valley without showing the people inside it. An aircraft could cross overhead without noticing a small cultivated area. A traveler could pass several kilometers away without ever knowing a family was living beyond the next ridge. The wilderness did not make them invisible. It made them insignificant from a distance. And sometimes insignificance is the strongest form of concealment. Their isolation was also protected by an assumption. People generally expect other human beings to behave according to familiar patterns. A family needs supplies, therefore it will visit stores. Children need education, therefore they will appear in schools. Illness requires doctors. Adults appear in employment records. People use roads, communicate with relatives, register births, purchase goods, and interact with institutions. The isolated family did almost none of those things. They had removed themselves from the systems modern societies use to notice that people exist. No purchases. No regular transportation. No telephone calls. No utility connections. No ordinary address. No repeated contact with institutions. From the perspective of civilization, they produced almost no signals. Their physical existence continued while their administrative existence faded. This helps explain why the discovery seemed so extraordinary. The visitors had not merely found people living far from town. Remote communities exist throughout the world. They had encountered a family whose understanding of history had separated from the surrounding society decades earlier. The valley had become a small pocket of another era. But describing them as people frozen in time would still be inaccurate. They had changed. Children had grown. Knowledge had developed. Tools had been adapted. The settlement had evolved. They had simply evolved independently, solving problems with whatever information and materials were available. Their culture became a mixture of memories inherited from the world they left and practices created by life in isolation. Then one aircraft changed everything. From above, someone noticed evidence that did not fit expectations. A clearing where there should have been uninterrupted wilderness. Cultivated land where nobody was supposed to be farming. A structure where maps suggested no settlement existed. That observation created curiosity. Curiosity produced another flight. then supplies, then contact. 40 years of isolation ended not because the family decided to reveal itself, but because someone finally looked closely enough. The discovery also demonstrated how dramatically perspective changes what we see. From the ground, the family's valley felt enormous. Mountains and forests created barriers that could take days to cross. From an aircraft, those barriers became shapes in a landscape. Distances that had protected the family for decades could suddenly be crossed in minutes. Technology had not necessarily made the wilderness smaller. It had changed the scale from which human beings could observe it. Once contact began, disappearing again would have been far more difficult. People knew the location. Routes could be recorded. Visitors could return. The family's existence had entered records and memories beyond the valley. The era of complete isolation was finished permanently. But perhaps the most remarkable part of their story was that discovery did not destroy their way of life immediately. They were not dragged into civilization. They were not forced to abandon the cabin. Instead, two worlds slowly learned how to communicate. The family accepted some changes and rejected others. Visitors learned that modernization did not have to mean replacement. Relatives re-established relationships across enormous gaps in experience. The valley became connected without becoming ordinary. And as the years passed, the original reason for the family's disappearance became increasingly distant. The war that had driven them into hiding moved deeper into history. The generation that remembered it firsthand grew older. Eventually, younger people could look at the same mountains without seeing protection from soldiers. They simply saw home. That transformation may be the most important part of the entire story. Fear had created the family's isolation. But fear did not have to determine how the story ended. Once they learned the truth, they could finally make choices based on reality rather than the danger preserved in their memories. For 40 years, they had believed the world outside was trapped in war. In reality, the world had changed beyond recognition. And while civilization moved forward at extraordinary speed, one small family had remained hidden among the trees, measuring history not through headlines or inventions, but through winters survived, harvests gathered, children raised, and another year in which nobody came looking. Until, finally, someone did. For more than 40 years, the family believed they were surviving because they had escaped the world. They had entered the wilderness carrying memories of fear, uncertainty, and conflict, convinced that distance offered the only reliable protection. What began as a temporary refuge slowly became a permanent home. One winter became another. Children became adults. Parents became old. Tools wore down, cabins were rebuilt, fields were planted and harvested again and again, while beyond the mountains the event that had driven them into hiding gradually moved from breaking news into history. The tragedy was not simply that they remained isolated. It was that they had no reliable way to know when isolation was no longer necessary. Without information, the final version of the outside world they remembered became the version they continued believing. Silence appeared to confirm their fears. Nobody came looking, so hiding seemed successful. No news reached them, so there was no reason to believe anything had changed. Year after year, the same decision became easier to repeat and harder to question. Meanwhile, civilization transformed. Roads expanded. Medicine advanced. Communication accelerated. New generations grew up. Human beings reached the moon. Cities changed their skylines. Machines entered homes. Information began traveling around the planet almost instantly. The family missed all of it, not because time stopped in their valley, but because their lives followed another kind of time, the rhythm of daylight, weather, harvests, births, aging, and survival. Then strangers arrived and shattered the belief that had organized their existence. The war was over. It had been over for decades. Nothing about the valley physically changed when those words were spoken. The same forest surrounded the cabin. The same river moved through the landscape. The same mountains stood on the horizon. Yet the invisible meaning of those mountains changed completely. For decades, they had represented protection from danger. Now the family understood that they had also been walls separating them from information, relatives, medicine, education, and choices they never knew they possessed. It would be easy to look backward and reduce their story to one enormous mistake. But history is rarely that simple. Decisions made during fear must be understood within the uncertainty of the moment. When the family first fled, they could not see the future. They did not know how long the conflict would last or what dangers might follow. Their original decision may have protected them. The tragedy came later, when temporary fear slowly hardened into permanent isolation. Yet their story is also one of extraordinary adaptation. They created a functioning life where failure could have been fatal. They learned to produce food, maintain shelter, preserve tools, survive severe seasons, raise children, and pass practical knowledge from one generation to another. They lived without many systems modern people rarely notice until those systems disappear. Their survival required discipline, cooperation, patience, and an intimate understanding of the landscape around them. When civilization finally reached them, they discovered something equally important. Progress did not erase everything they had learned. Modern medicine could protect them. Better tools could reduce unnecessary labor. Communication could reconnect them with relatives. But their decades in the wilderness had also taught lessons the modern world sometimes forgets: the value of resources, the importance of preparation, the strength of cooperation, and the difference between something being convenient and something being necessary. Perhaps the most painful discovery involved the people they could never see again. Technology could help explain the missing decades, but it could not return them. Relatives had grown old. Some had died. Relationships had vanished. Moments that normally connect generations, births, marriages, illnesses, celebrations, funerals, had occurred without them. That was the part of their isolation no modern invention could repair. But once the truth became known, the family finally received something they had lacked for 40 years. Choice. They could visit civilization. They could reconnect with relatives. They could accept useful technology. They could remain in the valley. They could leave. For the first time, staying was no longer an act driven entirely by fear. And perhaps that is what makes their story so haunting. Sometimes the danger that shapes a person's life disappears long before the fear of that danger disappears. Without new information, old beliefs can survive far beyond the circumstances that created them. For 40 years, one family looked beyond the trees and imagined a world still consumed by conflict. But the battles had ended. The soldiers had gone home. Cities had rebuilt. Children had been born, grown up, and started families of their own. History had continued without them. And when the outside world finally entered their valley, the family discovered that they had not escaped time. They had simply experienced 40 years of it somewhere almost nobody knew they existed.